Well, I'm hoping you've been able to find this talk on Facebook. If you've been following, I've been working through the book of Hosea. That's not by my choice, but I felt that God has called me to this most forgotten book because the message it contains is written as if it was written for this very day. I would love to bring you messages of great joy, but I have to tell you, God's heart is broken. He loves us so much, and yet people have wandered away from him. And much of this book is about judgment. I hardly know where to start today because it is quite a painful chapter, chapter 8. But to break us in quite gently, I have a little story to tell you. A couple had 2 little boys, aged 8 and 10, who were excessively mischievous. They were always getting into trouble with their parent, and their parents knew that if any mischief occurred in their town, their sons were probably involved. I hope you don't have children like that. There are lots of them about. Their boys, the boy's mother, heard that a clergyman in town had been successful in disciplining children. So she asked if he would speak with her boys. The clergyman agreed, but asked to see them individually. So the mother sent her 8-year-old in first, in the morning, with the older boy to see the clergyman in the afternoon. The clergyman, a huge man with a booming voice, sat the younger boy down and asked him sternly, "Where is God?" The boy's mouth dropped open, but he made no response. Sitting there with his mouth hanging open, wide-eyed, so the clergyman repeated the question in an even sterner voice, "Where is God?" Again, the boy made no attempt to answer. So the clergyman raised his voice even more and shook his finger in the boy's face and bellowed, "Where is God?" The boy screamed and bolted from the room, ran directly home and dived into his bedroom, slamming the door behind him. When the older brother found him in the bedroom, he asked, "What happened?" The younger brother gasped for breath and replied, "We are in big trouble this time, dude. God is missing, and they think we did it." And that's the title for those who like a title today. Where is God? Or God mislaid. During the past week, I've been looking through lots of commentaries on the book of Hosea. And believe me, there are lots of them. But the verse I want to highlight today is not mentioned a great deal. It's the final verse in chapter 8, which is a chapter containing a message of judgment, of punishment and calamity, which is about to fall on the people. In our Bibles, the first verse of the chapter reads, "Put the trumpet to your lips. An eagle is over the house of the Lord, because the people have broken my covenant and rebelled against my law. In the Authorized Version, the first word there is set. Now, there is no such word in the Hebrew text. Also in the sentence, as an eagle he cometh, the words he cometh do not occur in the original Hebrew text. But adding them makes for good reading. But the point is that in the Hebrew, it suggests two sudden trumpet blasts. The message of the prophet was intended to be one of arousal, and it began with those two clarion cries. Put the trumpet to your lips, as an eagle is over the house of the Lord. I think this is bang up to date for today. For surely we need to wake up and change our ways before it's too late. The COVID pandemic has made us change many things, even in our churches. But am I right in sensing that many of us are wanting things to return to normal, to before the COVID crisis? But let me tell you, things were in a terrible state even then. And we needed to wake up, as God has been seriously sidelined in our country. Now, I have never played a trumpet in my life. I think you'll be very glad to hear it. But I do know, after some research, that the Hebrew word for trumpet means the trumpet to the roof of your mouth. I gather that this produces a peculiar wailing sound. Then the prophet runs on in verses 1 to 3. Because the people have broken my covenant and rebelled against my law, Israel cries out to me, our God, we acknowledge you. But Israel has rejected what is good. An enemy will pursue him. As I've already mentioned, this chapter is a chapter of judgment. And if you carefully examine it, you'll find that Hosea gives the reasons for the coming imminent calamity. And it is as if he does so with 5 blasts of the trumpet. Or in other words, he names the 5 causes of the coming judgments. And he does so with a crescendo effect as he reveals the failure and the sin of the nation. So, what are the 5 charges he makes against them? And you'll see them clearly if you read the chapter. First, transgression and trespass. Secondly, false kings and princes set up to rule without consulting God. Thirdly, idolatry, the calf of Samaria, set up as a center of worship. Fourthly, the folly of seeking safety in an alliance with Assyria. And finally, false altars and sin as a result of them. All that, would you believe, is in chapter 8, until we reach our text today, which is verse 14. Israel has forgotten their Maker and built palaces. Judah has fortified many towns, but I will send fire on their cities that will consume their fortresses. This, then, is clearly a message of judgment. And in these words, we find the prophet's declaration of the all-containing sickness of which all the other things were mere symptoms. What then is the sickness? that is clearly stated in the words, Israel has forgotten his maker. Hosea goes on to describe the resulting activity of the people who have forgotten their maker. Judah is also implicated in this charge, along with Israel. There are two activities described. Israel has built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. These are activities which result when the people have forgotten God. The final word is the declaration of judgment. I will send fire upon the cities and destroy the castles. So let's look at this all-containing sickness, the resulting activity and its outcome. The all-containing sickness was that Israel had forgotten his maker. We all know what it is to forget, don't we? I do a lot of it. I sometimes think I've got amnesia. I'm ashamed to say that I forgot my appointment last week with my chiropodist. Naughty boy. Last week, I also managed to mislay my Boots Advantage card, and it caused me a lot of trouble to get it replaced, but I did. However, it's not so easy to replace God, no matter how hard we try, and the consequences are very much worse. But how can men and women forget God? Is that possible when he's their creator? I think today many have replaced him. For example, doctors and counsellors have rather replaced church pastors. The most common reasons for seeing a doctor are mostly to do with anxiety, stress, and sleeplessness. I think I heard that it could put the whole nation to sleep for 2 years with all the drugs that are given out to try and cure these maladies. All the best that the doctors can do is to spend just about 8 minutes with them and give them tablets. Years ago, people would have been to see the pastor. The doctor's consulting rooms are full to overflowing, and you often have to go on a waiting list for an appointment. But sadly, the churches are empty. Few pastors are consulted these days. During the pandemic, the country has looked to scientists and politicians instead of God. In fact, the church leaders have virtually been invisible and said nothing and given little or no comfort. We can deny or even try to replace God, but we cannot stop remembering him. Men and women do not forget God intellectually. Now, shall I surprise you if I tell you that the Hebrew word simply means to mislay? Israel had mislaid his maker. You know what it is to mislay something? You have forgotten it, but you have mislaid it. At first sight, such a statement seems to take the sting out of it. But if you think about it more deeply, you'll find that it puts the sting into it. To understand this, let's turn aside briefly and look for this Hebrew word, shaka, in other places in the literature. When this nation was in the making, the great God-given leader was Moses. After he led his people through that tremendous time and in their wanderings up and down in the wilderness, he was about to leave them. And taking the book of Deuteronomy at its face value, we find in this book his farewell addresses to this very nation. In these addresses, he constantly warned them against one grave peril. Do you remember what it was? Have we forgotten? Forgetting God. And whenever he did so, he used the same Hebrew word. In chapter 4 and verse 9 we read, "Only be careful and watch yourselves closely, so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them." That's the meaning of forgetting. Forgetting is personal neglect of things that are intellectually believed and failure to make them the central things of family life. Israel had mislaid God in its individual action and in its national outlook and in the dealing with its children. Let's look at chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, verses 10 to 12. "When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large, flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant, then you will eat and are satisfied. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." In other words, when you come into the land where you'll be prosperous, said Moses, when you are in the midst of easy prosperity, that dire and disastrous peril to national and individual life, beware lest you mislay God. Yet again in chapter 8 and verses 11 and 17, we read, "Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you this day. You may say to yourself, my power and strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me." The peril indicated is that of self-satisfaction, which follows when God is mislaid. And yet once more, in chapter 9 and verse 1 we read, "Hear, Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan, to go into and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky." And verses 4 and 5, "After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it's on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of their land, but on account of their wickedness of these nations. The Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And finally, in verse 7, "Remember this, and never forget how you aroused the anger of the Lord your God in the wilderness." These are but scattered sentences from these farewell discourses, but they reveal Moses' sense of danger of his people. He saw this nation, and he saw it down in the coming years, and he knew its supreme peril would be that God should be forgotten. If they could not intellectually forget God, they could mislay him. From these four quotations, we see personal neglect within the family to train the children, self-satisfaction that comes from such neglect, and the self-righteousness which leads to pride that says we have made ourselves great. And finally, that terrible mislaying of God that comes from prosperity, which says because of our righteousness and uprightness of heart, God has blessed us and has given us these things, and so God is put out of sight and mislaid. Let's return to the book of Hosea. The years had run on, centuries had run on, and everything Moses had warned them against had come to pass. And now the prophet of tears and thunder, as he declared an imminent judgment, said, "Here is your sickness, accounting for your transgressions and your trespasses, your false kings and your false princes, your calf in Samaria, your alliance with Assyria, the altars you are building. These are all symptoms. The sickness is that you have mislaid God, just mislaid him, till you have become oblivious to him. This then is the peril of men, the peril of a nation, mislaying of God." This used to be known as the people of the book. Where's the book gone? Where's God in our world today? This was written how many years ago? But it's like it was written this very day. Doesn't it describe the current situation? God has been mislaid in this nation. God has been mislaid in many families. God has even been mislaid in the church. How about that? So how do we come to mislay God? Perhaps firstly by giving an intellectual assent to the fact of his existence without actually living the Christian life. Sadly, there are numerous members of the clergy who've gone into the church as a career. They've studied theology, but do not have a living relationship with God. Intellectual orthodoxy will show what a man is, as surely as heresy will, unless there is action in life that corresponds with the accurate assent of mind to truth. That was the story of this nation. And whenever there is intellectual assent without corresponding action, there is spiritual dullness. Have you listened to somebody in the pulpit who doesn't know God? Aren't those the most boring sermons you could hear in all your life? We need the Spirit of God in our lives. God intellectually accepted without a response in the heart quickly fades away. God is neglected. It may be to the chapel, left there. It may be that God is only brought out once a week on Sundays. If that's so, God help us. We're not Christians. God is mislaid. He is lost. That was the trouble with Israel all those years ago. And dare I say it, that is the trouble with our nation today. he is lost as an active power, touching life and conditioning it, inspiring it, driving it, building it up. Israel has forgotten his maker, and so has the United Kingdom today. Oh, perhaps we could include America as well. So what happens next? Hosea recounts that Israel was building. Now, if we're reading the old version, it says temples, but the revised version says palaces. Which is right? Well, they're both right and they're both wrong. The word that the prophet used literally means spacious buildings. Whether that spaciousness was for pleasure or for worship doesn't matter. The passion of the nation came to be to build big things. Somebody says that these prophets are out of date. But think again. The passion for bigness is a system of capacity for the eternal, for God. And when men have mislaid him, then they try to build big things without him. Can you think of all the big things that are being built in the world today? Men are ever striving to put back the prison walls and build something larger and more spacious. We can see this all around us today on the material level, but all the material activity is the symptom of a mental and spiritual condition. Great buildings are the order of the day, aren't they? What about the buildings in New York, Chicago, London, just to mention a few places? It's an expression in the material which is tragically futile. And yet the passion for the big in humanity is revealed in buildings. The prophet says, you have forgotten, you have mislaid God, and you're putting up spacious buildings, skyscrapers. Then referring to Judah, he said, she's multiplied fortified cities. If building spacious buildings means the quest for spaciousness, what is the meaning of fortified cities? The quest for security? The attempt to secure safety? If the passion for bigness is a symptom for the capacity of God, the passion for safety is a symptom of the sense of peril. Safety first. Safety first. Have you heard that anywhere? Am I the first one you've heard that from? Safety first. That is what we're all saying. What does America demand? What is the UK seeking? What does France want? What do we all want? Security. My friends, there's no security on planet Earth without God. You can have all the tanks and battleships, but they do not give you security. It's to be found in a relationship with God. But security against what? I will tell you, the lack of God and things that result from it. The great prophet of Israel understood, we have mislaid God, and now we're building skyscrapers and engines of war. Humanity forgets God and gropes after the spacious and fights for the secure. I started today by saying that today's message was a message about judgment. And so it is. We cannot turn it into anything else, can we? How does it end? I will send fire upon the cities and it shall devour the castles. To forsake God is to ensure ruin. There's lots of prophets about today, but are they genuine? They're all telling us wonderful things are going to happen. They're not all genuine. This is a prophecy that's withstood time. It was written and breathed by God in the prophet Hosea. A fire? What does that mean? It does not necessarily mean that God was about to rain down material fire. Certainly not. Away down in Judah, when Hosea was prophesying in the northern kingdom, Isaiah was also prophesying. Let's go back to Isaiah for a moment and listen to something he said one day. In Isaiah 33 and verse 14, we read these words: "The sinners in Zion are terrified, trembling grips the godless. Who of us can dwell with a consuming fire? Who of us can dwell with everlasting burning?" Devouring fire, everlasting burning. What is that? Hell? Oh no. And hear him as he asks, who can dwell in that fire? He answers his question further on in the chapter. Who of us can dwell with a consuming fire? Who of us can dwell with the everlasting burning? Those who walk righteously and speak what is right and reject gain from extortion and keep their hands from accepting bribes, who stop their ears against plots of murder and shut their eyes against contemplating evil. They are the ones who will dwell on the heights, whose refuge will be the mountain fortress. Their bread will be supplied, and water will not fail them. Your eyes will see the King in his beauty, and view a land that stretches afar. So, who can dwell in fire? Well, it's the pure, those who do not forget God, who live in the right relationship with him. If we do not forget him, then that very divine presence flashes. The fire that destroys is the fire of the immanence of God. We cannot get away from him. We have mislaid him, yet he is at our elbow. We may be oblivious to him. We may do without him. But all the while we're living and moving and having our being in him. In his hand our breath is. And according to our relationship to him, he will bless or blast us. If we mislay God, we can build our skyscrapers. We can build more aircraft carriers. But we cannot escape the gradual oxidation from the exposure to air and moisture, as in the decay of old trees or of dead animals. We cannot escape God. My friends, that was not an easy message to give you, but I humbly ask you to examine yourselves. Have you mislaid God? Does God have the right place in your life, in your family, in your church, in your neighborhood, in our country? Do please take these words and pray. Although we may have mislaid God, God is ever there, just like the father in the prodigal son, waiting, ever looking out to see if we will return to him. Will we return? Because when we do, and when we repent, we'll see revival in our land. That's what I'm praying for. God bless.